Welcome back. In this mini lecture, I want to move away from general comments and the size of the comments and talk a little bit about the tasks, the functions of the House of Commons, and talk a little bit about distinctions between the British Speaker of the House, the American Speaker of the House, and the role of committees. So I'm thinking that there will probably be three mini lectures in this section. We'll see. Maybe if I really haul it through this one, I can get through the notes in two, but my plan is for three. When we look at the tasks and functions of the Parliament or the House of Commons in Britain, we're going to see a lot of commonalities with the American Congress, but with a difference in emphasis, and there will be a significant difference of emphasis in some of them, and in others, they will be relatively similar. So, for example, if we look at the first task or function of the Parliament in Great Britain, it says trains and recruits political leaders, right? And I've already mentioned how there is a lengthy apprenticeship for British prime ministers, how they have to rise up through the party, they have to prove themselves in the Commons, they have to prove their administrative skills as a junior cabinet and senior cabinet member. And this really builds a lot of party cohesion and loyalty because many of these leaders have worked together for a long, long time. Now, obviously, the Congress does provide leadership in the American political system, but it doesn't necessarily uh, lead to executive experience. I talked about that earlier. Certainly, it is true that someone from the Senate, say, can become president, like a John Kennedy, for example, or a Barack Obama, for example. But it may be that the president comes from state and local government as a governor, or a war hero, a general, or as we saw with President Trump, no governmental experience at all. But in Britain, as I've already mentioned, the only way to become an executive officer and to become prime minister is through the House of Commons. So certainly the Commons is the training ground, and it is where executive officers are recruited. So this function is far stronger in Great Britain than in the United States. Now, the second is the opposite, representing constituents. Obviously, in both Great Britain and in the United States, individuals are elected by voters. In both countries, representatives represent a particular district. But in Great Britain, the primary allegiance is to political party. In the United States, people decide where they are going to run for office. So, for example, I live here in Merced, and if I wanted to run for Congress, and I don't have any such ambition, although you may find this interesting. When I lived in Sacramento, I was recruited, not heavy, but I was recruited to run for the California State Assembly up in the Elk Grove area many years ago. And it's a long story, but I politely said no. But in Britain, the party decides where you run. You don't get to decide that for yourself. And as I pointed out often, and I will point it out again later when I get to political parties, often political parties will test newcomers by putting them in a district that they're going to lose. But the question is not whether they lose because they're kind of set up to lose. Margaret Thatcher, in fact, the first two times she ran for the Commons, she was put in a district that was going to be very, very difficult for her to win, and she did not. But she impressed party leaders with how she campaigned, the fact that she did better than expected in her district. She kept working hard for the party nationwide, And when she came up for election a third time, they put her in a toss-up district, a district that was competitive, and it was a seat that she ended up winning. So this representing constituents is a little bit different. For example, in Britain, you may represent a district where you don't live, you don't know the community that well. You get to over time if you represent it. But in the United States, with rare exception, you're going to have people live in the district they represent, and there's going to be a more personal relationship between constituents and congresspersons. For example, I'm a Yahoo, right, political science teacher, and yet there was a period of time where I was invited to breakfast with our former congressperson, uh, gave input, got input. My former congressperson up in Sacramento, we actually had each other's phone numbers and spoke from time to time. So the relationship was much more personal. The third task, informing the public through floor debate and question time. Now, I told you earlier that Roskin and I have a little bit of a disagreement on this. I don't think either of us are right or wrong. I think both of these are true. And then it's a question of which one do you give more emphasis to. So, um, Roskin points out that the opposition at question time, for example, is trying to make the government look bad. I think he uses the term to try to make the prime minister break under pressure. These are very experienced people. They have been in politics for a couple of decades, maybe more than that. And it's very unlikely they're going to break under pressure. You may be able to do a gotcha question from time to time. So I think in an ideal world, would you want to make the prime minister break under pressure? Hell yeah, of course you would. But I don't think that's generally what happens. And I don't think that it's usually the objective. I think the objective of the opposition is to demonstrate to voters, take a look at us. We are a reasonable alternative to the government in office. If you don't like the direction that the country is going, if you don't like the policies that are being implemented, you know who to blame. It's their fault. And if you elect us, you're going to have reasonable leadership and leadership that will take the country in a better direction. Fourth, the House of Commons is a lawmaking body that scrutinizes and refines legislation, even though most legislation comes from the executive branch. Uh, they do scrutinize it, they do refine it. From time to time, they amend it. And ultimately, it is the House of Commons that has to pass laws for British society. And that is the same, obviously, in the United States. For a bill to become law, it has to be passed in identical form in both chambers first, and then the president has to sign it. Now, remember in Britain, if the House of Commons passes a law, it does not have to be signed by the Prime Minister. It'll be signed by the Queen of England, and it is a routine signature. It merely formalizes the legislative process. And as I've told you before, the monarch has not vetoed a piece of legislation in Great Britain since 1707. It's not going to happen. If the House of Commons passes it, it is the law. Fifth, and this is a significant difference between the House of Commons in the American Congress. The House of Commons can compel the resignation of the government through a no confidence vote. Unlike the United States Congress, that can only impeach for high crimes and misdemeanors, the House of Commons does not need any justification for a no confidence vote. They can merely say that we lack confidence in the leadership of the Prime Minister. Keep in mind, we had a president who was actually impeached by the House of Representatives twice, Mr. Trump, but the Senate did not vote to convict in either case. So um, theoretically, The House and the Senate can coordinate to get rid of an executive officer. They've never formally done it. Mr. Nixon did resign from office, but as I've mentioned, British executives have left voluntarily on 4 occasions just since 1990. The sixth function is they provide finances for the state by authorizing taxation. Just as the House of Commons uh, authorizes taxation. We stole that in our Constitution. All money bills in the United States start in the House of Commons. Not the House of Commons, the House of Representatives, obviously. I got Britain on the brain today and not the United States. But in the United States, the House of Representatives has to originate the measure. But of course, in the United States, the Senate has to agree to that. And then the seventh, the last one, is the House of Commons reviews. They scrutinize public policy. They review budgetary allocations for departmental agencies. In the United States, the term we use for this is legislative oversight. Um, and certainly we see that in the United States, although I will say that in the United States, the executive uh, really is the one that disperses that money to the various agencies. You may remember talking about it in American government with the Office of Management and Budget. If we look at the Speaker, this is a role that's often misunderstood in Britain because in the United States, the Speaker of the House is the leader of the majority party. The Speaker of the House is the most powerful member of Congress, is third in line to the president's. And in Great Britain, the Speaker is a neutral figure. The Speaker can only vote if there is a tie. This is very rare. It's only occurred 49 times in the history of Great Britain, and there has not been a tie in the House of Commons since 1990. So in the United States, the Speaker of the House is dominant. The Speaker of the House appoints all members to the Rules Committee, which really is the lifeblood of the legislative process in the House of Representatives. The Speaker of the House in the United States can get virtually all legislation that they favor to the forefront of scrutiny, can get it to the floor quickly. That is not the role of the Speaker in Britain. The Speaker, again, neutral, only votes if there's a tie. And in reality, the primary purpose of the Speaker is to be an umpire and to maintain order in the Commons. And again, if you go on YouTube and you take a look at question time, in Great Britain, you will notice how many times the Speaker will say order, order, or hit the gavel, or will, you know, reprimand somebody to, hey, basically you need to behave. The last thing that I want to mention, so we are going to have a third mini lecture in this section, and it's going to be a short one, are the role of committees. To me, in the United States, committees are the most intriguing part of Congress. They're highly specialized. I call them the lifeblood of Congress. They hold hearings, they scrutinize legislation, they call witnesses, they're well organized, they're well financed. And if you want to watch Congress at play, watch these people give speeches to empty chambers. But if you want to watch Congress at work, go watch committee hearings on C-SPAN, and that's where things get done. In Britain, this is not true. Committees are generalized, they don't filter legislation. British committees don't call any witnesses, they gather very little data, they are almost totally dependent on the executive branch for information. In the United States, Congress has their own experts. They are not reliant on the executive branch for data, and that makes them far more powerful. The ascendancy of the government, the prime minister and the cabinet over the commons, is largely due to the presence of party government, which ensures the government will and can count on its supporters in the commons. to support their programs. In the last mini lecture, I will talk about the House of Lords and the positive features of the British fusion of powers model.